Okay. So I'm really excited to be here, and it's nice to meet you. Thank you for bearing with us through that. If you have a GitHub account, I feel like I might know you a little bit because I've been spending the last 2.5 years watching what you do. Especially if there's anyone out there that's done something a little weird, or maybe written an emotional support ticket, filled out a survey, or have been part of a study. We've probably met. So I'll tell you a little bit about me. I live in Sausalito, just outside of San Francisco. I'm actually professionally trained as a historian. I studied gender and labor, and I used to write about women in aviation. But in order to fund my history habit, because that habit I kept for about 10 years, I decided to learn how to design websites on the side. So I became a UX designer, and then eventually I was able to bring both UX design as well as my background in ethnography and research together, and I was hired as GitHub's first user researcher. There's nothing like talking to people. But before I go further, I also love pugs. And that is just a very special shout out there, because I love including pugs in my slides too. I had a nervous slide because I wanted to let you know how nervous I was, but then there was a complete meltdown up here that you got to watch, so I'm feeling less nervous. But I did want to explain that one of the things, that just to get it out there, I'm not actually an engineer, so I felt pretty nervous when I was starting at GitHub as GitHub's first user researcher 2.5 years ago. So of course, the thing that I did when I started at GitHub was I started to look at GitHub to see what people have been talking about with user research. And I talked to Justin about this morning. He happens to be in the audience. But I found this post, which was made shortly before I was hired. And it was, we make informed design decisions by using the products we build on a daily basis. We keep what works, remove what doesn't, and improve what needs to be improved. I think formalizing that process and having a UX researcher is a slippery slope. Hired. Also, Justin and I now work on research together, so we've had things come full circle. But I was trying to figure out what would be really interesting to people who come, about user research who comes to Monitorama. Jason asked me, and I was like, yes, I'd love to talk. And then I was like, oh no, it's not my audience. I don't know what I'm going to talk about. Because what would actually, what can I tell you about if we're talking about the kinds of event collection that happens at Google and Netflix and Twitter? I spend my days, maybe talking to 5 or 8 people and trying to come up with insights to inform parts of our product decision-making process. I do research like this, where I actually give people markers and I ask them questions about their workflow, and I look to see actually what colors they use, to see where they feel sensitive about the process. As you can tell, pull requests are a bit difficult for newcomers. So I consulted another engineer, Dietrich, and I said, what would you be interested in about this talk? And he said, well, I'd be interested in, the many ways that hidden variables can screw us. And I was like, yep, that makes sense to me because all products have blind spots. So today I'm going to share some stories about some of the blind spots that we have. I'm going to start with an example. Does anybody here have a GitHub username? Great. Do you ever @mention people with GitHub usernames? Excellent. Now, I don't know if you can see this from the slide, but there is a company, because we had a flaw, that was actually the only way that they could get their identities to map to GitHub Enterprise was with these actual 6-digit numbers. So in order to @mention your peers, you also had to know their employee numbers because you couldn't use their names. So this is the kind of thing that you can't necessarily surface with monitoring. This is the kind of thing that you get when you go out and you sit with users and you kind of go, oh my God, this is how they're using the product. How on earth are you remembering those 6 or 7 people's identities with numbers? This is terrible. So think of research as GitHub's flashlight. I spend a lot of time looking for our blind spots. I advocate for measurement, and I get to deliver good news, things are working, and I also spend some time delivering bad news. We should not ship this, it's not ready. And I was thinking about how does all this come together. Monitoring tools, I've been seeing a lot of what is happening with systems, and I spend my days thinking about why are those things happening. So I feel like when we're talking about monitoring, you're quickly going into a science and research mode. How long does it take for an external system to respond? What are the background tasks that are happening in our overwhelming like our databases? But where are we at with our memory usage? We're predicting events, we're responding to incidents, we're working on capacity planning. In my days, I'm like, what the fuck are people doing? So what I try to do is figure out, like, how do we uncover the why something is happening? When we have all this quantitative data, we still don't know why people do the things they do. And yesterday, I took this right off of Vanessa's slides. She said that there's a gap between the metric and graph. The gap between metric and graph to insight can be huge. So even with great tools, we can gather data on poor or unusual behaviors for a really long time. And I would add something to this, which is that the gap can feel overwhelming, and it can also be filled by overconfidence in the way that you think people are using your product. So then we had Steven who came around and said, research, like without it, all you have is luck. So GitHub has been very, very lucky. Yes. But a few years ago, our newest users started changing, and people were signing up for the site. And they weren't signing up they weren't the same people who used to sign up for the site. So for the last 18 months, we've had a small 5-question survey as part of our sign-up process. It's optional. You're entered into an experiment if you actually receive it. And one of the questions in there asks about Git knowledge. And it turns out that 71% of our new users who sign up from around the world sign up and they don't know Git. So we have a blind spot. I spend a lot of time looking at graphs, but again, like, you can get really lost in them. So the way that I think of myself and the way that I think of our field research is that we're the human instrument, and we need to have human instruments in order to get answers to socially meaningful questions. So we do this with surveys, with interviews. We can talk about graphs, but what I'm really looking for when I'm talking with users are grins and grimaces. Watching someone use a product will change the way you understand your product. So I like to get out from behind the numbers and get our engineers out from behind the numbers and in front of people. And it's super easy. Like, you can do it just over video. You don't actually have to go anywhere. When we talk to people, I think of talking to people looking for 3 things to try to keep it simple. Goals. People hire your product to help them achieve some goal. What is it? Motivations. Those are the underlying reasons people behave in particular ways. When goals and motivations are not in sync with your product, people create workarounds and they become very effective at using bad design. So I'm going to give you a small example that I think relates to monitoring. You can think of it as that maybe somebody on your team is running a really large job, and maybe the solution is you decide whether you're going to limit or block them. That might depend on some social judgment. But what you could do instead, as a modest proposal, is talk to them about their goals, get a sense of their motivations, and think about how to design a better solution. But you have to develop trust in research, and you develop trust by listening to the right people, so you have to actually find the right people. When you're designing something for millions of people, it becomes really hard to take things away. So we used to be able to ship features out really fast. But if we do that now, and people adopt new behaviors, it gets really hard to take those behaviors and change them again at scale. So when you introduce complexity, you have to understand what it's going to do today and what it's probably going to do 2 years from now to your product. Insights from the wrong audience, and sometimes the wrong audience is the loudest audience, they're a loud minority, might encourage you to head in the wrong direction. So this is where I go into my Nancy Drew mode when I'm trying to figure out who do we talk to for what study. So I asked you before for a little participation. I'm going to ask you again if you would just raise your hand if you use github.com and keep your hands up. Okay, great. Wow, this is great. Okay, now, keep your hands up if you actually use GitHub Enterprise. Okay, great. Now, keep your hands up if you administer GitHub Enterprise. All right, now I want you to look around. We should all talk. I should buy you drinks. giant hug. So that's what my life is like when I'm trying to find the right audience. And it's actually really, really hard to get connected with people who administer our enterprise product. I want to give those people a hug because it's a product that's actually out of our hands. It's like on your hardware. It's literally out of reach from any monitoring system we have. We have an abundance of data on GitHub.com, and it's really interesting stuff. But we have an absence of data on what actually is happening inside of GitHub Enterprise. We can look at payment, we can look at account age, we can look at volume and the types of support tickets that are coming in. And we can listen to feedback that comes in from our sales team from the field. But the problem is, how do you study a black box? So my first story, and I have 3, is how do you study system administrator happiness? Yes. So I realized that, when I started this study, I actually did interviews with system administrators, and they were so angry. So I realized that happiness might not be the right word. We have a lot of system administrators, and I couldn't go out and talk to all of them, and I couldn't do anything about this black box, and sales comes in with great insights, but I might be listening to the wrong things, I might react in the wrong way, and we might lead our product team down the wrong path. So what do? We designed a biannual survey, and I know what you're thinking, oh my god, a survey, but wait for it. So instead of happiness, what we're really looking at is less frustrated as a metric. And we need this metric to be something that we can measure over time. Because when you do a survey, you get a snapshot, right? You get this one moment, you get one thing from a group of people, and it's a little interesting. But when you do it again, and you look to see if there's a change, it's way more interesting. And then you do it again, and again, and again, and you notice whether you have declining scores or improving scores. You notice what's changing inside of your product. So this survey instrument that we designed measures 3 things. Demographics, because I don't know much about our system administrators. Product experience. I want to know, where is the product failing you this quarter? Is it with releases? Is it with our documentation? Is it with core product features? And the last thing is Net Promoter Score, which is something that a lot of companies, I think, are using, and that's your willingness or the likelihood you have to recommend a product to another colleague or friend. And the reason that we measure this is because sometimes GitHub administrators may not have the decision about bringing the product on premise, but they do have a lot of power in how they talk about the product to other teams and in how often they update the product. And these things are really important to us. So we're looking at what we need to do to improve a score over time. The other thing is that when we get this data back from our biannual survey, it's just 10 questions. It's actually very short. And we get this data back. We don't actually look at it with any kind of average. We take a look at it and we look at it through revenue. So we look at how much money are the different customer types spending. We look at it through account age. So how long have you been using the product? The longer you've been with the product, do you have more debt with the product? Do you feel worse about our product? Do you feel better about our product? And I can tell you that releases hit us hard, they hit us hard last year. And if you were administering GitHub, they'd probably hit you even harder. Open text is one of the places where I spend a lot of time. Those are the comment fields inside of surveys. And this was one of my favorite quotes from last year, where we said, well, where do we need to improve the most? And someone said, faster, smaller packages, more reliable update procedure. I wet my pants each time I upgrade. Holy hell. That's like, open text responses will delight and destroy you. This is what I love about research. And we're looking for chattiness here too. Are people who are unhappy more chatty? We get a lot of people who actually write in Markdown and then they'll shove it into a small comment field. So I'll get something like this, and it's awesome. But a survey, the instrument that we designed, it's only good if it's repeatable, if it's longitudinal so that we can study it at the company level, and it's actionable. We never actually ask a question if we don't have the ability to do something with the answers. So a takeaway from our last one, which was we're going to actually publish it out to our enterprise customers in a few days, is that we need to increase our product focus on the administrator experience. We're not serving you well right now, and you told us, and we want to do better. So I'm going to tell you a second story, and this is about GitHub.com, and this is about the slow rollout of a really large feature. Literally a large feature. Has anybody here heard about GitHub large file storage? Yeah? All right, so we have a cool thing where you can now actually use, Git. You can use large files in Git, which is great, because for a long time you couldn't. And you can even store your files on github.com. But before we rolled that out, there were a lot of things that were keeping us up at night. Pricing and billing, because we were actually going to have an add-on, and we were going to have a free plan. And we weren't sure if we were nailing the price, if we were being too stingy. We were in the middle of a billing transition at the time. So we also wanted to make sure that we were doing right by the open source community. We were worried about infrastructure. We wanted to be responsible and stable, and we weren't sure what would happen as people were stuffing large files into the app. So we started to do small ships with large files leading up to when we got to large assets. By the way, that was from, do you remember a time when you used to have to sign up for a WordPress account in order to have your gravatar show up on GitHub? That's when we took that away, so working on large files. And we were worried about support volume. We were wondering what this ship would do to our support team. Would we actually generate too much volume? Would we be reckless with our customers? So we developed a 3-part research plan. And I love this plan. We started with a survey, we moved into a pre-release program, and then an early access program. I'm going to spend most of my time talking to you about the early access program, but the survey, we had a sample size of 1,800, and they were randomly, you got access to the survey through a random sampling of the people we were able to reach through the site. We sourced people who were interesting from that survey to be part of a closed pre-release. So we had somewhere between 20, we had about 20 survivors, I would say, at the end, but we started off with about 30 people who we gave the feature to early, and we hand-held them through. And that's how we learned that we needed to not focus on game development, but actually focus on super nerdy developers who were working from the command line. And then we launched an early access program, and we had about we had more than 13,000 people sign up, and this is where we had to get really creative. Our early access programs actually run, they're run as a controlled experiment. So there's selection bias here because you have to sign up to enter it. It's a little bit like a clinical trial. So you sign up, and one group gets the treatment, and one group doesn't get the treatment. In order to sign up, you have to tell us a little bit about yourselves. And what we want to do is mitigate bias and ensure a diverse sample. So we have you fill out the screener. We get these demographics, and we have other personality traits from within the app, and we create 2 groups. Like I said, the treatment group, you get the feature, the control group, you don't, but you will, and you will before anybody else still, so we're responsible there too, because we're dealing with human subjects. See this one question? We really wanted to know what were people using to store their large files. And then we said go. It was go time. We gave people the feature, we enrolled them, and then we waited about 6 weeks. And 6 weeks later, we noticed we didn't have a lot of usage. So we sent 2 surveys. One survey to people who actually used the feature, and another survey to the people who didn't. And what we learned is that it takes a lot of time to change your workflow and adopt a new tool. And we also asked people if we could grant them a wish, what would they wish for? And we learned a lot about pricing. Those 3 data sources together changed our knowledge about the world, and we realized that we had forgotten something really important. For years, we've been telling you all, don't use large files with Git, go elsewhere. We reified that with file size limits on github.com, and then we asked people to leap into a new belief system, adopt a new tool, and change to a new behavior quickly. And that doesn't work. You actually have to create incremental paths if you want to change core human behaviors. So this is the framework that I use when I think about designing with behaviors and researching behaviors. You have current behaviors, the things that you're used to doing every day right now. New behaviors, the ones that you're open to adopting if they help you achieve your goals. And aspirational behaviors, which is the place we really want you to get to. Our Git LFS model, I would say we had a successful launch in many, many, many ways, and it's an amazing open source project. It's just going to take a while for people to adopt it, because we had forgotten what it would mean to actually go through those steps and create something incremental to help introduce it. And that's why we did the experiment. Going from a current behavior to an aspirational behavior, thinking it's going to be easy, is kind of crazy. Adoption takes time and trust, and it's actually really hard if you work with more people, because they have to adopt a new workflow with you. So we have rough areas to switch, or like to work on. We have another EAP running right now. I don't know how many of you love your current GitHub organization and user permissions model. But I want to tell you the new model. And you are able to register for early access. Now you know my secret though, so you may get it or you may be part of the control group. But you can sign up for that early access model. And just a little quick note here, so we have this little in-app pop-up, which is how it's one of the ways that we recruit people into our programs. Again, not an engineer, and didn't have an engineer on my team, and was told, researchers that need engineers, that little pop-up took the site down for 7 minutes. Research is dangerous. When you sign up for new organization permissions, you're also going to be asked a series of questions, and I love these questions. But my favorite question is this last one. We want to know people's philosophies about granting organization member access. So the reason we want to do this is we want to know about openness and closed. And we want to ask this question twice, once at the beginning, and we're going to ask it again at the end, because we want to see if belief systems change with new permissions. Do they stay the same? Are people happy? My last story is the story of the undo button. Because asking good questions when you do user research is actually really hard. It's easy to go into an interrogation mode. People, when you do user research, a lot of them come in with a lot of ideas about what they want, and they start with the answers. They tell you about the solutions they want you to design. And what we try to do is step back to learn more about the source of the problem, the emotions that might accompany it, and then we start thinking about how to change it. So, how do you choose a contribution model when you're building a project? We have 2 ways, branching or forking. And I am hearing a lot of feedback these days about branch permissions. Does that resonate with anyone here? Before we actually add branch permissions, and I don't know that we will, we wanted to explore where people were experiencing trouble and why. Most organizations use one model. A small minority do use both. So when do you branch and when do you fork? So we did an activity, and it's called the feature prioritization activity, where we listed out a series of features with people we were interviewing, and we asked them to put them in order from the most to the least important. But one of these is a sneak attack. And the sneak attack is the undo button. And people in this research study would say, what? There's an undo button on GitHub? Or they would say, wait a second, a little bit of skepticism, what do you mean by undo button? And I would ask, you tell me, where would you use an undo button? I want to know, how would an undo button help you? And I want you to tell me the story about when an undo button would have helped you. When did something go supremely wrong and you wished you could have just hit undo? That's actually how we're setting permissions, how we're working on pull requests, how we're working on merges and force pushes, and what solutions we're going to produce. And there will be an undo button. I'm just not sure where we're going to put it yet. So, what are the ways hidden variables help us connect with humans is what I think. And I love measuring hard to measure things because I think they're a lot of fun to measure. And I'm going to give you a guarantee that if you think in terms of human behaviors and you get out from behind the numbers and you talk with people, you will become better at discovering and solving problems. And that crazy product process I was showing you before, we're working on GitHub issues. So we're not going to flip the switch and give you a new product. We're going to iteratively study small things that we are changing along the way to get you to a place where you will be much happier. So I started off at this conference thinking, I do not know that I'm going to be able to do this or fit in here because I am not an engineer. And my friend Justin had told me before, sometimes you gotta look for your people. And as I've been here, I realized like you all are my people because you're doing scientific research with monitoring tools. And I wanna hang out and I wanna help out. So if you have interest in any of these things or early access to, or interest in early access to features, these are the things that I'm focused on right now, and I would love to hear from you. I would love to bring your organizations into this. And thank you. That's it.